Do you remember the specific weight of the door at a funeral home, the way it was heavier than any door you touched in ordinary life? Hinged so it closed slowly, deliberately, with a soft pneumatic sigh instead of a slam, as if the building itself had been engineered to make sure nothing loud ever happened inside it. You remember the smell before anything else. Carnations and gladiolus. Heavy and sweet. Layered over the specific mustiness of wall-to-wall carpet that never quite dried out. And underneath all of it, something clean and chemical you couldn't name as a kid, but that your body understood as serious. You remember the light. Lamps instead of overheads, everything amber, nothing casting a shadow harsh enough to make you flinch. That was 1950s funeral home design, and it wasn't accidental. It was a whole discipline of American life that got engineered, room by room, to manage grief with more architectural intention than almost any other building type of the era. Before we get into how these places were actually built, and why they eventually faded into something colder and more corporate, if you're the kind of person who likes remembering the textures of American life that never make it into the history books, the sounds, the smells, the specific feel of rooms that don't exist anymore, go ahead and subscribe. That's genuinely the whole mission here. We're not chasing the big headline moments. We're trying to hold on to the ordinary architecture of American days, the stuff that shaped how people actually lived and grieved and gathered, before it gets paved over and forgotten entirely. To understand the funeral home you remember, you have to go back to a man named Robert L. Frost, no relation to the poet, who in 1936 opened a small funeral supply house in Cincinnati, and by the post-war years had become one of the country's leading educators in what the industry called mortuary science. But the real origin story is bigger than any single man. It's the story of an entire profession pulling itself out of people's parlors. Before the 20th century, death happened at home. The body was washed at home, laid out in the family's own front room, which is where the word parlor attached itself to funerals in the first place, and buried within a day or two, because there was no refrigeration and no embalming infrastructure to slow the process down. The undertaker was often just the local furniture maker because he already owned the tools and the wood to build a coffin. What changed everything was the Civil War. Thousands of families wanted their sons' bodies brought home from distant battlefields, and a New York doctor named Thomas Holmes developed arterial embalming techniques that made that possible, embalming an estimated 4,000 soldiers himself, and effectively founding modern American embalming as a trade. By the 1880s and 1890s, embalming had moved from a battlefield necessity into an urban profession, and by the 1920s and 1930s, that profession needed a building of its own, not a home, but a purpose-built structure that could house the embalming room, the display rooms, the chapel, and the family's grief, all under one roof, engineered specifically to remove the burden of death from the family's own living space. That building is what we now call the funeral home, and by the 1950s, it had reached its most fully realized form. Walk in with me. The vestibule alone did work you never noticed. It was a buffer zone, a small transitional room between the parking lot and the main interior, and its entire job was to slow your body down, to strip away the ordinary noise and hurry of the outside world before you crossed into the next threshold. The floor changed under your feet right there. Hard tile in the vestibule, giving way to thick, sound-absorbing carpet, often a deep maroon or forest green, laid wall to wall, specifically because carpet swallowed footsteps, and a funeral home in the 1950s was a building engineered almost entirely around the control of sound. You never heard another visitor's shoes. You never heard a door slam. Every surface in that building was chosen, consciously, to soften the acoustic experience of grief. The lighting followed the same logic. Funeral directors of the period relied heavily on indirect, warm-toned incandescent lighting, table lamps, wall sconces, cove lighting recessed into crown molding, specifically avoiding the flat, overhead fluorescent light that was becoming standard in offices and schools during the same decade, because fluorescent light rendered skin tones cold and clinical, and the entire visual philosophy of the mid-century funeral home was to make the deceased, and the room around them, look warm rather than sterile. The wallpaper was almost always a damask or a floral pattern in muted golds and burgundies, the kind of pattern meant to be present without being noticed, and the furniture, heavy wingback chairs and sofas upholstered in velvet or mohair, was arranged not for conversation but for quiet proximity. Chairs angled toward the casket rather than toward each other, because eye contact between mourners was something the room was subtly designed to make optional. The slumber room, as it was often called then, the space where the casket itself sat for viewing, usually had a separate, discreet entrance for the family, distinct from the public entrance everyone else used, so that a grieving widow or mother could arrive and leave, without walking past a receiving line of neighbors and co-workers, if she wasn't ready to. That detail tells you how much thought went into these floor plans. The casket itself sat on a bier, often draped in a casket throw of the same fabric as the room's drapery, under a canopy of flowers arranged in a specific vocabulary of grief. Standing sprays for close family, wreaths for friends, and small basket arrangements sent by acquaintances who wanted to be counted present without claiming the closest emotional territory in the room. And behind all of it, hidden almost always down a separate hallway or in the basement, was the preparation room, the space most visitors never saw and most funeral homes never wanted them to think about. Tiled floor to ceiling in white or pale green ceramic, drained at the center, lit by harsh clinical light that was the deliberate opposite of everything happening one floor above. That room ran on a rhythm most families never questioned. Embalming fluid, replacing blood through the arterial system, a process refined over decades since Holmes's Civil War work, allowing a body to be viewed comfortably for days instead of hours. The building itself, then, was really two buildings stitched together, a clinical one behind the walls and a domestic, almost theatrical one in front of them. And the entire architectural achievement of the 1950s funeral home was making sure you, standing in the velvet-chaired slumber room with the lamps glowing amber, never once felt the seam between them. But here's the thing people rarely talk about when they remember these places fondly. The 1950s funeral home wasn't just architecture. It was a business model built on a specific kind of information asymmetry, one that depended on grieving families not asking too many questions during the worst week of their lives. Funeral directors in this era typically presented a single bundled price: the casket, the embalming, the viewing room rental, the hearse. The staff, as one number, often delivered verbally in a private office with the same soft lighting and heavy furniture as the rest of the building. And families in shock, culturally discouraged from haggling over the dead, tended to simply agree. There was real dignity in that architecture. There was also, quietly, real vulnerability built into it. The velvet chairs and the amber lamps weren't only there to comfort you. They were also there, whether anyone said so out loud or not, to make questioning the bill feel almost unthinkable. That vulnerability is exactly what started to unravel the whole system, and it happened faster than most people realize. In 1963, journalist Jessica Mitford published The American Way of Death, a scathing investigative book that accused the funeral industry of exploiting grief through inflated prices, unnecessary embalming, and manipulative sales tactics, and the book became a national bestseller, landing on the New York Times list, and staying in public conversation for years, fundamentally shifting how Americans viewed the profession. Congress responded slowly, but eventually decisively. After years of investigation into industry pricing practices, the Federal Trade Commission implemented the Funeral Rule in 1984, legally requiring funeral homes to provide itemized price lists to any customer who asked, in writing, before they committed to anything. That single regulatory change dismantled the bundled, private, take-it-on-faith pricing model that the entire mid-century funeral home had been architecturally and emotionally designed around. At the same time, the physical model itself was being squeezed from other directions. Cremation rates, which sat below 4% nationally through most of the 1950s, began climbing steadily through the following decades as cost pressures, changing religious attitudes, and greater geographic mobility made the traditional multi-day viewing and burial model feel increasingly impractical for families scattered across the country. By the 2010s, national cremation rates had crossed 50%, according to data tracked by the Cremation Association of North America, meaning more than half of American families no longer needed the elaborate slumber room, the embalming suite, or the heavy velvet furniture at all. Independent, family-owned funeral homes, which had defined the industry through the 1950s, often passed down through 2 or 3 generations bearing the family's own name on the sign out front, also faced consolidation pressure starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1990s, as larger corporate chains like Service Corporation International began acquiring smaller operations, standardizing their interiors, and in many cases stripping out the ornate, labor-intensive Victorian-influenced decor in favor of more neutral, lower-maintenance corporate design. What that meant in practice was the slow disappearance of a very specific American room. Not the funeral home itself. Funeral homes still exist, obviously, in nearly every town. But that particular version of it, the amber-lit, velvet-chaired, sound-swallowing parlor, built explicitly to slow your grief down and hold it gently for a few hours before sending you back out into the world. The building didn't vanish. It got renovated out of existence, one fluorescent light fixture and one open-plan reception area at a time. And it's worth being honest about what today's version actually gets right, because this isn't a simple story of decline. Modern funeral pricing, thanks directly to that 1984 FTC rule, is dramatically more transparent than anything a 1950s family would have experienced. And itemized general price lists mean you can now walk into most funeral homes and know exactly what you're paying for before you sign anything. Cremation, now chosen by the majority of American families, is typically far less expensive than traditional burial, often costing a few $1,000s compared to burial costs that can run past $10,000 once you include the casket, the plot, and the headstone, which has made a dignified farewell financially reachable for far more families than it was in your grandparents' generation. Green burial options, largely unavailable in the 1950s, now let families choose biodegradable caskets and skip embalming chemicals entirely, reflecting environmental values that simply weren't part of the mid-century conversation. What we lost, though, is harder to itemize on any price list. We lost the forced, unhurried architecture of communal grief, the slumber room built specifically so an entire neighborhood might drift through over 3 consecutive evenings, sit in those velvet chairs, and simply be present with a family's loss, in a way that today's often single-afternoon, appointment-scheduled memorial service rarely makes room for anymore. So tell me, do you remember the specific weight of that door? The carpet under your church shoes? The particular gold of a lamp in a room built to hold sorrow without ever raising its voice? What funeral home from your childhood still sits somewhere in your memory, and whose service was it that you walked into, not fully understanding yet what that heavy, quiet room was actually built to do for you?